Here are three of the wide-angle lenses I own for the Canon system. This is the 16 prime RF 2.8. Here's the latest lens I just bought, which is the 14 to 35 f4 RF. And then this one I've had for a while now. This is the 16 to 35 f4 with IS. And they're all full-frame lenses. This one I have to use with this EF to RF adapter because I no longer own any EF Canon cameras. But I could use this lens for my Panasonic. I have a Metabone speed booster, and I was using it a little bit, but it was just too much of a hassle to use this lens. I really didn't gain much advantage using an EF to micro four thirds. So I stopped using it for that, and I exclusively just use the 16 to 35 for all my wide shots, mostly for photography. But in this video, I will talk about the video capabilities of these lenses because I haven't really seen a lot of comparisons with these particular ones with my setup. My primary camera is the R5 for photography, full frame, so everything there is matching the focal lengths. But I just purchased the Canon R7, which is an APS-C crop censored camera. It crops in 1.6 times crop. So by having a 1.6 times crop, I pretty much lose the wide angle shots with my lenses, with my other sets of lenses that I use for photography and for video. So I wanted to invest in more wider angle lenses. A 16 millimeter on a crop size sensor is not 16. I think it's a 25.6 millimeters, so 26 millimeters, let's say. When you pair this with the R7, that's the wide angle equivalent. And then when you go all the way into 35 here, that becomes like a 56 millimeter. 14, it's a 22.5 wide angle with the 35 millimeter equivalent. And those millimeters, when it comes to a wider angle focal range, the incremental 1 millimeter makes a really big difference. When you're telephoto, the millimeter doesn't make as much difference. So for example, I have a 24 to 70, and I don't see a difference between 70 millimeters and 105 millimeters necessarily for what I do. But I can see the difference between a 14 and a 16 on full frame and APS-C. So in this video, I'm going to do some footage comparisons, and I'm going to put all of these lenses back to back so you can see what the wide angle field of view looks like on an R7. I'll test a little bit of the R5, but mostly for the R7 because I got the 14 to 35 for my R7 specifically, and it is an excellent pairing. It is great. I didn't get the RF APS-C RFS lenses. That there's a couple that are available with the R7. I didn't get those because I wanted it to also use lenses that would work on the R5. But I previously had owned the Sigma 18 to 35 1.8. A lot of people have this lens. I've reviewed this lens on my channel in previous videos, and I thought this was going to be the best pair with an adapter, EF to RF adapter. And I was using it, and I did have some videos, which I'll put below, that shows this in action for video. But because it's an older lens and there are some quirks with it, focusing wasn't, it was fine, but it wasn't as smooth as the Canon glass. I did notice it being louder. This is also no image stabilization in this lens, which doesn't matter as much because there's in-body image stabilization in the R7 and the R5. But having lens stabilization helps. And I noticed that there are just some quirks with this lens that wasn't clean to me. It wasn't a clean image. If you liked those quirks, and I did like some of the lens, the shape of it and the tone and the texture that this lens was giving me, but it's not for everything. So I'm going to still use it, but it's not going to be my all-purpose lens anymore. And also, at 18 millimeters wide angle, that's closer to like a 30 millimeter. And I don't want that. I wanted more of a wide angle. I thought the RF 16 was going to do it, but even 16, 25 or 26 millimeter as a wide angle, still not enough. But this does it right here. This was very affordable in comparison to a lot of other Canon L series glass. Usually you'll be spending over $2,000. This was, I think right now you can get it on a holiday sale for about $1,300. There's not enough. This hasn't been out long enough to hit the used market, but once that comes along, maybe in a year from now, you're going to start seeing these for cheaper used. And I really like it. I like it fits so well with the R7 because the R7 has a smaller body. And when paired with this it's great. It was meant. I feel like it was meant for the R7. It's just so nice. When I'm using the Sigma here, you have to have the adapter, the RF to EF adapter, and it just has it's longer, and this is also heavy. It doesn't look as heavier than this, but it is heavier than the 14 to 35. 14 to 35 is surprisingly light. Maybe the one thing I don't like as much with the 14 to 35 is that the lens does go in and out of the barrel here, and it goes out and in at different points of the focal range. So it's not like 14 is already all the way in, and then when you go to 35, it zooms out. It's like if you want it completely flush to the lens, you got to go kind of in the middle of 20 right there. Whereas this lens here, the 16 to 35, the entire zoom range is inside the body of the lens, so you don't see it as you zoom. It stays within there. So this is really good for gimbal work, for example. This also has lens stabilization, which is fantastic. It really does a way better job than I thought it was going to do in comparison to these other lenses, because these other lenses this one rather, has image stabilization. And I was comparing the image stabilization. I'll show some footage of that as well. Canon 16 prime, f8, image stabilizer is on. Canon 16 to 35 EF at 16. Canon RF 14 to 35 at 14 millimeters. Still at f8. Just my brief summary of it is the 16 to 35, it is good with image stabilization on the RF, on the R7 and the R5, but the 14 to 35 is clearly better image stabilization when you have the lens stabilization on in combination with the IBIS. it's really smooth. Not as smooth as a GH6, a Panasonic GH6, but way smoother than the 16 to 35, and way, way, way better than using the Sigma 18 to 35. Going handheld with the 18 to 35, I really had to use some stabilization body techniques so that it wasn't getting jittery, the moving of the frame that it does. And in my test footage that I shot with it, it was doing that. This one, not so much. The other things I like about the 14 to 35 is that it's smaller. You can see right now. It's got a small footprint. It's a 77 millimeter thread, so there's a lot of the L series glass that are all 77 millimeters, both EF and RF. So I'm glad it sticks with 77 because I can use my filters across all my lenses. But look at the footprint is amazing of how small it is here. Once you throw on the EF to RF adapter, this becomes quite large. It wasn't as large when I used to roll with just my EF glass, like a 5D Mark IV. This was fine. Almost the same size without the adapter, but you need to put the adapter on if you want to switch over to the RF mounts. And look, it's big and heavy. R5, bigger body, and it fits just as well. It looks just as nice. Really good size. And then on the full frame, 14 millimeters is wide, really wide, like GoPro wide. Because I know some people want to see what the bodies look like on the lens, the sizes. This is also 77 millimeter, so I use the same filters. But see, if you look right here, the lens makes a big difference with the size of the camera, and the EF version, it looks bigger because it is bigger. Now the problem with the 16 that I've been encountering is that never mind, it's not comparable to a zoom, obviously. It's a prime. And it should be better in low light because it's at 2.8, and these are both at f4 all the way through the zoom range. But what I noticed with the 16 prime here is that in photography, there's heavy vignetting that needs to be corrected in camera or in Lightroom, in whatever post-processing editing you use for your photos. It needs to be done. If you just take the raw JPEGs directly from the camera and then try to post that online, you're going to see vignetting distortion on the edges with the 16 here. If I had to choose among these three lenses, if I could only have one, I would keep only get the 14 to 35. Unless you have an EF Canon camera, then you need to do this one. This is the only one that's EF. But if you're going to be with the RF system, which is what Canon wants you to do for the future, the RF mount, the 14 to 35 is a good value. I would just get it. This lens is amazing so far. I'm very happy with it. I'm probably going to get rid of the 16 to 35 and the 16 prime because I don't see, now that I have the 14 to 35, these don't seem as useful to me. And I could use the 14 to 35 for both cameras. Okay, so now I will show some test footage using these three lenses with the R7 and a little bit of the R5. F9, this is 16mm prime. F9, 16 to 35 EF at 16. (14 to 35 RF, F9, 14mm. 14 to 35 RF at 14 millimeters f8. $35. 14 to 35 RF at 14 f9. $35. 16 to 35 EF at 16 f8. $35. 16 to 35 EF, f9 at 16. $35. 16 millimeter prime at f8. $60 millimeter prime at 16 f9.